file landed on the briefing table with a sound like a gunshot. Colonel Harsted didn't look up when Specialist Dempsey walked in. He was reading something else, or pretending to. The fluorescent light in the forward operating base briefing room hummed at a frequency that made everyone's teeth feel slightly wrong, and Dempsey stood in the doorway for a full 4 seconds before he acknowledged her. "Close the door," he said. She did. "You're the shooter command is sending me." It wasn't a question. The way he said it made the word shooter sound provisional, like something he'd agreed to use under protest. Dempsey had heard that tone before. She'd been hearing it for 6 years, in different rooms, from different men wearing different ranks. She'd learned not to answer the statement behind the statement. She just said, "Yes, sir." Harsted finally looked at her. He had the kind of face that had settled into permanent skepticism somewhere around his late 40s. Not cruelty exactly, but a deep and practiced doubt in the intentions of the world. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a part that arrived from a supplier he doesn't trust. "They tell me you shot expert at Bragg?" "Yes, sir." "They tell me you qualified on the M110 in 11 weeks in." "10, sir." A pause. Not a long one. But enough. "Sergeant Kellner's team is wheels up at 0400. You'll be embedded as their secondary overwatch position. Kellner will brief you on comms and call signs at 2200. He looked back down at his papers. "That'll be all." Dempsey picked up her file from the table and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She had learned a long time ago that slamming doors was something people did when they still hoped someone was listening. She'd grown up in Amarillo, which meant she'd grown up with wind. Not gentle wind, not the kind that moves through trees and makes a sound like breathing. Amarillo wind was a different thing entirely, a flat and remorseless pushing that came across the panhandle like it had somewhere to be and resented everything in its path. Her father drove long-haul freight. Her mother taught 3rd grade and sang in the church choir and made the best beef stew Dempsey had ever tasted, which was the kind of detail that doesn't seem important until you're sitting in a forward operating base in eastern Somalia, eating a protein bar that tastes like chalk and thinking about it. She'd been 12 when her mother got sick. She'd been 14 when her mother stopped getting better. She'd been 15 when she learned what it meant to run a household because the person who was supposed to do it was dying. And grief doesn't pause for practical considerations. Her father wasn't absent exactly. He was present in the way that a man can be present when he's been gutted and hasn't figured out how to put himself back together. He showed up, he drove, he signed the forms. But somewhere between the diagnosis and the funeral and the weeks after the funeral, the particular version of him that used to laugh at his own jokes and burn the pancakes on purpose because it made Dempsey laugh, that version went somewhere else, and he never fully came back. She joined the Army at 17 with her father's signature on the paperwork. He didn't try to talk her out of it. That might have been the saddest part. Basic was harder than she'd expected and easier than she'd feared. She discovered at Fort Jackson that she had a talent for stillness, not patience exactly, but the ability to go quiet inside herself in a way that most people couldn't. Her drill sergeant noticed it on the range first, the way she'd settle into a shooting position with a kind of completeness, like a door being closed gently but firmly from the inside. He didn't say much about it. Drill sergeants, in her experience, rarely said the complimentary things directly. But she noticed he started scheduling her last on the range, which meant he was watching. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone except herself. She'd wanted to be good at something that mattered, and she'd found it in the improbable stillness between one breath and the next. Kellner's team met her at 2200 in a room that smelled like gun oil and dry sweat. There were 5 of them. Staff Sergeant Kellner was shorter than she'd expected from his voice. On comms during the pre-brief, compact and deliberate in his movements, with a quality of attention that Dempsey recognized from the better NCOs she'd worked with, the ones who were always quietly accounting for everything in the room. The others were Corporal Brannick, who had the particular kind of sunburn that only happens to people who are constitutionally unable to remember sunscreen. Specialist Vance, different Vance from the list she'd been given, a coincidence. A lanky kid from somewhere in Georgia who kept calling his rifle Patricia in a way that was either deeply charming or deeply concerning. She hadn't decided yet. And Sergeant Okafor, whose file said he'd been attached from a different unit, and who looked at Dempsey the way people look at something they haven't decided how to categorize. The 5th was Corporal Pym, who handed her a cup of coffee without being asked and said, You want milk in that? In the tone of someone who already knew the answer, and she decided she liked Pim. Kellner walked them through the mission. The objective was a compound outside Barawe, a coastal town about 200 kilometers southwest of Mogadishu. Intelligence had identified a procurement coordinator for a network that had been supplying timing components for IED construction across 3 regions. Not a trigger puller, not a commander, but the connective tissue without which a lot of other bad things became harder to do. The mission was capture, not kill. Capture, interview, extraction. Secondary overwatch will be Specialist Dempsey, Kellner said, without particular emphasis. She'll hold the ridge position here, he pointed at the map, with line of sight to the east approach and the courtyard interior. Okafor looked at the map, then at Dempsey, then back at the map, in a sequence that communicated something without saying it. Question, Sergeant? Kellner said. No, Sergeant. Dempsey drank her coffee. It was terrible, and she was grateful for it. After the brief broke up, Brannick drifted over to where she was checking her kit and stood for a moment with the particular body language of a man who has something to say and is negotiating with himself about whether to say it. You were at Bragg, he said. For a while? You know a guy named Torino? He said he shot with a woman who was... Brannick stopped, apparently recalculating. He said she was pretty good. Dempsey looked at him. I don't know a Torino. Right, a pause, okay. He drifted away again. She went back to her kit. Pim appeared at her elbow, apparently from nowhere. Brannick's harmless, Pim said. He just doesn't always know how to talk to people he hasn't figured out yet. I'm not complicated, Dempsey said. No, Pim said, looking at her kit with what seemed like genuine professional appreciation. You really aren't. They flew out at ZO 415, low and dark, the kind of flight where you don't talk because there's nothing useful to say and the rotors make conversation a project anyway. Dempsey sat with her back against the fuselage and went through the mission in her head the way she always did. Not rehearsing exactly, more like clearing the space, identifying the variables she could control and the ones she couldn't, and making a decision about which was which. The ridge was 300 meters northeast of the compound. She'd be in position before the team reached the perimeter. Her job was to hold the approach. If someone came early, if something shifted, if the compound had more inside it than the intelligence suggested. She was the answer to a question the mission planners hoped wouldn't get asked. She'd been the answer to that question before. Usually the question didn't get asked. The one time it had, she'd been 22 years old, and it had been a different country, and she'd made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that she still thought about sometimes when she was trying to sleep. That was the thing they didn't put in the recruitment materials. The decisions didn't take long. The living with them was what took time. The bird touched down in a dry wash about 4 kilometers from the compound, and they moved on foot through the dark. The terrain here was scrub and rock, the kind of landscape that looks empty until you've been moving through it for an hour and realize that everything that lives here has developed a very efficient relationship with concealment. The stars were extraordinary. Dempsey noticed them the way she always did, briefly and with a kind of acknowledgement. The stars over Somalia and the stars over the Texas Panhandle were the same stars, which was a fact she found useful without knowing exactly why. She split from the team at the designated point and moved upslope toward the ridge. Kellner's hand signal was simple, a flat palm. Hold, watch, be ready. She was. The ridge gave her what she'd hoped for. The compound was a converted farmstead, 2 structures, a main building and a smaller outbuilding, enclosed by a low stone wall that had clearly been extended at some point. Newer mortar visible at the joins. The courtyard was about 20 meters across. She could see the east gate from here, and through a gap in the main building's east wall, she had a narrow but usable angle on the interior courtyard. She settled into position and adjusted her scope. It was 311 local. The compound was quiet. A single light burned in the main building's north-facing window, not moving, probably stationary lamp or fixture, not someone awake and active. She logged it. In her earpiece, Kellner's voice came through very quiet. Team in position. Stand by. She stood by. This was the part that people who hadn't done this tended to misunderstand, the waiting. They imagined it as dead time, empty time, time between the real things. What it actually was the job. The watching was the job. The stillness was the job. Everything else, the decisions, the actions, the seconds of loud, irreversible consequence, all of that grew out of the patience that came before it, like a single shot growing out of a breath that had been held perfectly still. Her mother had been a patient woman. Dempsey thought about that sometimes, without knowing what to do with it. Kellner's voice, moving. She tracked the team's approach in her peripheral vision, while keeping primary focus on the east approach. The gate team was clean and quiet. The compound's exterior was clear. Then the east wall moved. Not the wall itself. A section of shadow detached from the base of the wall and became a man. And then there were two men, and they had not come from inside the compound. They had been outside it, positioned along the wall's exterior in a way that suggested they'd been waiting for exactly the approach angle Kellner's team was using. Counter-surveillance. Someone had expected a team. She keyed her comms. Black 1, I have 2 tangos exterior east wall, 30 meters from your 6, armed. A beat. She held her breath. The 2 men at the wall were moving, not toward the team, not yet, angling to improve their own position. One of them raised something to his face, a radio, which meant there were more inside and someone was about to get a message. Black 1, recommend you do not wait. Another beat, shorter. Then, clear. She exhaled slowly, the way her brag instructor had taught her. Not an exhalation of relief but of mechanics, the breath that was the last variable before everything else was fixed. The 2 men at the wall were no longer a threat. She was already scanning for the next problem. The next problem was inside the compound. What intelligence had described as a single-occupant target house turned out to contain 4 additional personnel. Bodyguards, probably, or some variant of the category. Kellner's team breached the main building and found themselves immediately in a confined engagement with people who'd expected to have more notice than they got. Dempsey heard it in her earpiece, clipped, controlled communication giving way to shorter transmissions, the vocabulary of a team that was busy. Brannick, right, clear. East room, 2, contact. She was already repositioning. From the ridge, she had no useful angle on the building's interior, but the courtyard was different. If anyone came out of the building moving fast and heading for the exterior gate, she'd see them. Someone did. Not the target. The target, as it turned out, was a man who sat down on the floor the moment Kellner's team entered and put his hands on his head with the practiced calm of someone who had clearly spent time thinking about what he would do in this exact situation. Later, Kellner would describe him as almost disappointingly cooperative. What came out of the building and into the courtyard moving very fast was someone who hadn't decided to cooperate. He was heading for the gate and he was carrying something. And he was talking into a radio, which meant he was either calling for more personnel or he was triggering something that was already in place. Neither option was good. The courtyard shot was 91 meters. The angle through the gap in the east wall was narrow, maybe 1.5 meters of viable shooting lane. He was moving right to left, which introduced a calculation that had to happen faster than conscious thought, which was what all those hours at Bragg were actually for. She made the shot. The radio hit the ground. The call didn't go through. Black 1, she said, courtyard is clear. A pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then Kellner's voice, very level, copy, good work. She was already scanning the east approach again. The extraction took 40 minutes. The target was processed, secured, and moved to the helicopter with a speed and efficiency that Dempsey had learned to recognize as the particular output of a team that was running on adrenaline they weren't letting themselves acknowledge. Okafor had a cut on his forearm from something that had gone wrong in the east room and was applying his own pressure dressing with the expression of a man who found the whole thing mildly inconvenient. Brannick was talking, which was apparently what Brannick did when he was wound up, a low and continuous stream of commentary that no one was listening to, but everyone seemed to find oddly comforting. Pime fell into step beside Dempsey on the movement back to the extraction point. 91 meters, Pime said, through that gap. Yeah, I almost didn't think that was going to go. I knew it was going to go, Dempsey said. Pim looked at her sidelong and then laughed, a short, genuine sound in the dark. Of course you did. The helicopter came in low and loud and beautiful, the way they always did, and she was on it before she'd fully processed that the mission was over. 3 days later, she was in Harsted's office again. He had the same expression as before, the settled skepticism, the man who trusted the world about as far as he could throw the concept. He had a file on his desk that she recognized as the after-action report. Kellner's report says you made a 91-meter moving target through a 1.5-meter lane, Harsted said. Yes, sir. At SO 340, yes, sir. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He closed the file. The target provided information that led to 2 network interdictions in the last 72 hours. he said. Partly because the call he was trying to make didn't get through. A pause. That's on you. She didn't say anything. Kellner has put you in for a commendation, Harstead said. I've approved it. He picked up a pen and then put it down again, which seemed to be his version of a concluding gesture. That'll be all, Specialist. She turned to leave. Dempsey. She stopped. Harstead was looking out the small window at the side of his office. Dusty glass, a view of the compound perimeter, and beyond it the particular dry nothing of this part of the world. He didn't look at her when he said it. Kellner asked me to give you a standing offer on his team. You'd cross-attach with their next rotation. A beat. I told him I'd pass it on. Yes, sir, she said. Thank you. She left. Outside, the wind was blowing, coming off the coast with a smell of salt and red dust. Not Texas wind. Different direction, different temperature, different content. But the same quality, she thought, that same feeling of something that didn't particularly care about you, that was going where it was going regardless. She walked back toward the barracks and thought about her mother's stew, and about the stars, and about the shot at 91 meters, and about the particular way the afternoon light had been falling across Kellner's compound when she'd first set up on the ridge, and thought, I can see everything from here. She had learned something at some point in her life about what it meant to be underestimated. How it was, in the beginning, a wound, the kind of wound that you didn't show because showing it felt like conceding something. And how over time, if you let it, it became something else. Not armor, exactly. More like a very specific kind of fuel. The knowledge that the people who decided you weren't worth watching had given you a gift, even if they'd given it without meaning to. They hadn't watched. She had. That was always going to be the difference. Pim found her outside the mess hall that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee that were equally terrible, and handed her one without being asked. You putting in for Kellner's team? Pim said. Dempsey took the coffee. She thought about Harstead's office and the way he'd looked out the window when he'd passed on Kellner's offer, like he was examining a conclusion he'd arrived at reluctantly but hadn't decided to fight. Yeah, she said. I think I am. The wind was still going. The stars were starting to come out. She drank her coffee and looked at them for a moment. Amarillo stars, Somalia stars, all the same stars, and then she went back inside because there was work to do, and she had always been the kind of person who went back inside. That was something she'd gotten from her mother, among other things.